Kate Mila-Falcha. Welcome to Irishgrannyhelen. I have a very interesting story today, and it's timely given the nature of the majority of Hollywood movies these days, the thematic thing going on. But before I start, I just wanted to say thank you. If you're watching this and if you're subscribed, double check you're subscribed. There's strange doings on YouTube. People find themselves knocked off their subscriptions for no apparent reason. Check you're subscribed, hit the thumbs up. The reason I ask is because when I sort of changed the makeup of my channel in November, I lost a lot of subscribers. And that's unfortunate because we have fun here. And everything I used to do, I'm still doing. I'm just doing it behind the paywall on Substack. Also doing a lot of fun things completely free for the public on Substack. Ask Your Irish Granny. In the meantime, we're still doing things here. Later today, I'm having a conversation with Carrie O'Donnell, and I have some more stuff coming up this week. Thank you for sticking around. Thank you for staying with me. I really appreciate it. It's been a difficult couple of months, and it seemed appropriate today, given that it's January 6th. January 6th, the night of January 6th, 2021, that should probably ring a bell, was the day where I finally got my YouTube channel up and running. Really started the next day, but the night of January 6th, which I think is significant. So thank you very much for sticking around and for watching. And I appreciate the feedback. If you have things you'd like me to get to do here, I'll be getting together with Denise. I'll be getting together with Gerald. I'm getting together with Marina, with Alice of Heart and Soul. I mean, just the usual suspects. And I really appreciate you guys sticking with me. I'm very grateful. So today I want to talk about Superman. George Reeves, the original Superman, who died very mysteriously. It's one of the enduring Hollywood mysteries. And as usual, I'll cover the details today, give you the story, and then I will be doing a deeper dive on my own, the way I usually do, on my Substack, Ask Your Irish Granny, and then getting together with DEBBRA to do a real question and answer look at it, also on Substack. So if this story intrigues you, you might want to pursue it over there. And I would like to thank the fabulous Karina Longworth, who has a podcast called You Must Remember This. She's a journalist and something of a Hollywood history expert. And her podcast, You Must Remember This, is fabulous. If you like stories of early Hollywood, silent films, black and white films, the old movie stars, the studio system, really interesting stuff. And her work is so well researched, and I appreciate her very much. I used her as a resource when I researched this. I just got the usual superficial stuff off the internet, but I had remembered her podcast being full of detail. So I quickly went back and took notes on it to augment the notes I already had. So I might be doing a little bit of peering closely because my handwriting, I inserted notes from her, and it's very tiny handwriting. So please bear with me because it's a fascinating story. So let's look at the super George Reeves. He was born January 5th, which, happy birthday yesterday, 1914 in Woolstock, Iowa. He was an Iowa farm boy. He was born 5 months after his parents were married, and that didn't last long. They separated very soon after his birth. His mother took him, of course, because he was just like barely a couple of months old, went with his mother to her relatives, and in Kentucky, and then to her home in Illinois, her parents' home in Illinois. You get the feeling there that there may have been some family tension about this very premature baby. She later moved to California to be with her sister. And in 1920, she met and married Frank Joseph Bessolo, I don't know. In 1925, Reeves' biological father married Helen Schultz, and Reeves never saw his father again once that marriage happened. In 27, his stepfather, Bessolo, adopted him, and he officially became George Bessolo. This marriage between his mother and his stepfather ended after 15 years. They did something so odd. George went away to visit relatives on vacation as a kid. I guess he was, 15. He was a teenager. He was only probably about 15 and a half. They separated while George was away visiting relatives. And when he got home, his mother told him that the stepfather had died of his own actions. I've got to be careful of the terminology I use. George didn't know for several years that Bessolo was still alive. Bessolo really died March 4th, 1944. He was only 51. And this was long after George became famous as a movie/TV star. So George began singing and acting in high school, and he performed while he was a student at Pasadena Junior College. He met his future wife there, Eleanor Needles, and interestingly enough, her great-great-grandfather founded the John Robinson Circus. This was a big circus, like Ringling Brothers or whatever. He's called a circus magnate. I wonder if Needles, California is named after her family, because her last name was Needles. I should have looked that up. I didn't think about it in time. So Eleonora and George married September 22nd of 1940 at the Church of Our Savior in San Gabriel, California. They never had any children. They got divorced 10 years later. He began in the movies as a great role, and Deborah Lupian and I were talking about this the other day. We confess, and it's so politically not correct, and I apologize, but this is a fond memory from my childhood. I had a girlfriend, my best friend, when I was a little girl. She was from a family of 7 children. They lived half a block up the street, big Catholic Irish family. Her mother was Lithuanian and her father was Irish from New York City. They had spent a good deal of time in Charlotte, North Carolina, while he was going to college. And he was in the small publishing business. They did small books like those Sunset 8x11 paperback books of, beautiful patios, that kind of thing. And they also specialized in historical books about the South. So there were books like Plantations of the South or Old Mansions of the South. And there were a number of books that they made called The Ghosts of the Magnolia State or Famous Hauntings in Mississippi, And she and I were really into that. So we used to pore over these books when her dad wasn't home. And because they didn't want us to get all worried and nervous about the ghosts. What ended up happening was I got exposed to her father's interest in the South. And he was one of these guys that learned all the songs from the Civil War and, goober peas, for example, eating goober peas. I can't believe I remember that. And so I was sort of immersed in this information, which I didn't really focus on, didn't pay a whole lot of attention to. And she started bugging me there's this really good book, because we were bookmobile pals. We spent a lot of time getting books at the library, the bookmobile. She goes, there's this really good book. You've got to read it. It's about the Civil War. And I was like, I'm not interested in the Civil War. I'm really not interested in that. She said, no, you really, 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 really like it. So eventually she talked me into reading Gone with the Wind, because it was like, I didn't have an option better than that particular week, and she hit me at a weak moment. I loved the book. And I read it every year from the time I was 11 till the time even when I was older and went away to college. I read it every summer. For some reason, I would have to revisit it every summer. And the movie is, of course, problematic. The whole story is painful. But I do have an attachment to it from my childhood. Quite obviously, it didn't brainwash me into thinking everything was okay down there in the South. So one of the best scenes is the first scene in the movie. George Reeves was in it. He plays Stuart Tarleton. Now, the Tarletons were, Scarlett O'Hara's this belle of her neighborhood. All these rich, disgusting people who own tons of slaves, enslaving people and getting really rich. And they have all these balls. I think what fascinated me about the book was the structure, the very formalized structure of the plantation families. It was kind of like reading about royal families and their terribleness, the princes in the tower, that kind of thing. Little bit like, what's that terrible show I tried to watch, I couldn't stand it, George Martin, it's fantasy. Game of Thrones, yeah. A little bit like that. All these formalized manners and expectations. I was horrified by the expectations that the women were expected to live under. It was awful. The book has a whole lot more characters, more children for Scarlett O'Hara and her sister. A lot more going on in that book than came onto the movie. But for a 5-hour movie, it couldn't include everything. It was such a long movie. They had to give you a break in the middle. And it had some memorable scenes in it. And the very first opening scene, Scarlett is sitting on the front porch with these two brothers who are neighbors, who are identical twins. One of them is the bright red hair. One of them is George Reeves, plays Stuart Tarleton. And her very first line, war, war, war. I'm so sick of war. I'll never forget that line. George Reeves, Superman, he had this great role. It wasn't big, but it was an important role because it kind of set the stage for what was going on. He and the young man who played his identical twin brother, they had to dye their hair red for the role because they were famous, the Tarleton twins, for their bright red hair. Anyway, after Gone with the Wind was filmed, he went back to Pasadena and was at the Pasadena Playhouse. He got a lead in the play Poncho, and this got him attention and a contract from the Warner Brothers studio. They renamed him because, I don't know, I guess George Reeves sounded better than Bizarro, I don't know. Because of the film release schedules of Gone with the Wind, they made it a year before it was really released, things like that. They do a lot of post-production work. Meanwhile, he had gotten this contract, and he was in 4 other movies in small roles, and they got released before his role in Gone with the Wind was ever seen. And I think I have to add one more thing about the movie Gone with the Wind. This is before streaming. This is before videos and CDs. If you saw a movie, you saw it in a theater. And Gone with the Wind, MGM was very clever. I do believe it was MGM, I think. They locked it up. And periodically they do a grand re-release in the theaters, and they make more money from it. Everybody would go because it hadn't been seen in years. So the first time it was released, re-released, when I was aware, I was about 12 or 13. My friend and I went, and it was everything we had hoped in a movie made from a book. So my apologies for liking something about such a terrible time period, but you know, honesty, what can I say? So George Reeves had himself 5 roles in a row. He also made some 2-reel shorts, some B pictures. Those were the pictures that were sort of second on the B side, you know. And he made them with Ronald Reagan. And he made 3 with James Cagney, one of my favorites. So his career really wasn't helped dramatically by these, and eventually his contract fizzled out, and that was that. But he got lucky and he signed with 20th Century Fox, and he made a couple of films with them, but they weren't terribly successful. So he started to freelance, and he was in a lot of Westerns. He got a really good role. He was in 5 different Hopalong Cassidy Westerns. I can't believe I remember those. And then he got cast opposite Claudette Colbert in So Proudly We Hail. It was a Paramount war drama in 1942. I think it won Academy Award. He got a Paramount contract for 2 films a year out of this role. He was drafted in 1943, and the movie So Proudly We Hail, it kind of revved him up and made him all patriotic. So most young men at that point kind of were of that mindset. And he joined the Army Air Force. Remember, at that time, the Air Force and the Army were not separate. They were together. And he appeared in Army Air Force, the Broadway show called Winged Victory. And it was really popular, revving up the patriotism. They did a national tour. Then they made a movie version. And then he was transferred to their first motion picture unit, and they made training films for soldiers. After the war, he went back to Hollywood and to the studios, but they were slowing down. They were shuttering their sets, and it was just not the best time for the studios. It was phasing out. So he got forced to be in a number of low-budget things, a serial called The Adventures of Sir Galahad. He took a job digging cesspools. Think about that. But he had a really good memory for dialogue, and he was also able to play against type. For example, he was a villain in a Johnny Weissmuller movie, Jungle Jim. He separated from his wife in 1949, and then he moved to New York City, and then his divorce was final in 1950. He did some live TV anthologies and radio, and then he went back to Hollywood and did Fritz Lang's movie Rancho Notorious. In 1953, he got a minor role in the movie From Here to Eternity. This got Best Picture. And so he was in 2 Best Picture films, and that was a help. In 1951, he was offered the role of Superman in a movie, and the movie was going to be a pilot. He was reluctant because, like many serious actors, they thought television was just unimportant. It was a blip on the media, radar, and they didn't think very many people were going to be following television, be interested in it, or even see anything on it that was made for it. But he took the job because he needed work. And it started out with, by the way, the pilot, a movie. So he made 2 half-hour shows every 6 days. It was a brutal schedule. And the way they made the show, they did multiple shows that were filmed simultaneously to take advantage of standing sets. So, for example, Perry White. All of Perry White's office scenes for 3 or 4 episodes in a row would be shot on the same day. And then the next day, they take that set down, they do the apartment set, and all the apartment scenes for the same 3 or 4 shows would be shot that day. So it actually began with Superman and the Mole Men, which was a B movie, but it was also intended to be a pilot for the TV serial. So as soon as the movie was filmed, they figured it was going to go, and so they began the first season's episodes. They filmed for 13 weeks in the summer of 51. And the movie got released in 1952, and he became this huge national celebrity. It was shocking to everybody that it was so popular. ABC purchased the show and intended for national broadcast. He got contracts with the studio with ABC, but they were very restrictive. They were not allowed to do a contract for any other role while they were filming Superman, and it was only an 8-week run, but they had what was called a 30-day clause, which meant that the producers could demand their exclusive work for a new season in 4 weeks. So they could get done filming for 1 season, and if the producers wanted to be, they could call them up the next day and say, in 4 weeks, we're going to start filming again. So they didn't have the freedom to commit to long-term work on major films or stage plays or other series. They couldn't, because they would be interrupted. On the first day, this is interesting, on the first day that he showed up for work, he had cocktails with him, and he said to Lois Lane, the actress who played Lois Lane, he said, Phyllis Coates, I believe her name was, he said, "Here's to the bottom of the barrel, babe." Reeves very cleverly took advantage of the role. He leveraged it. He couldn't take other roles. He couldn't commit to other contracts. But what he did was he arranged numerous personal appearances across the country as Superman. He took his image, being a role model for children, he took it really seriously, and apparently he had quite a lot of affection for his young fans. He wasn't dismissive of them. He appreciated it, and he was really nice to them. He went out of his way to be kind and to talk to them, and it was, probably a smart thing on his part. For example, he smoked, but he wouldn't smoke around children, and eventually he quit because he didn't want to be a bad example. He had a very discreet private life. A lot of girlfriends, let's put it that way. But then he had a very long-term affair with a woman who was a decade older than he. Her name was Toni Mannix. She was married. She was married to Eddie Mannix, MGM's fixer. We're going to talk a little bit about him as a little sidebar here. It's really important. She called Reeves the boy. Eddie Mannix and his wife, now he was really abusive. We'll talk about what happened to his first wife. He was very abusive. He was allegedly extremely corrupt. They slept at the opposite ends of a long hallway that had a red carpet, and Eddie Mannix would joke about it with people. He called the red carpet the Red Sea. So his job with MGM was to cover up for the private lives of the stars. Like if something happened in their lives, he would go and hide evidence and concoct alibis and that kind of thing. He also was the muscle. He'd been a bouncer. He had numerous affairs. He was very abusive and profligate, and they stayed married because they were Roman Catholic. No comment. His first wife, now, this is really interesting. He and his first wife had a similar relationship, very distant. She didn't play around, but he did. So they separated. She moved to Palm Springs, so they weren't even living in the same house. He started living essentially almost like they were married. with an actress from the Ziegfeld Follies dancers called Toni Lanier. She was called the girl with the $1 million legs. He fooled around constantly while he was married to his wife, while he was having this relationship with Toni Lanier. After they moved in together, allegedly they got married, but before that, his wife died. His wife had enough when he moved in to with Toni Lanier, and she filed for divorce, and she publicly on the divorce petition accused him of physical abuse and said that he had broken her back and had the goods to prove it, and she wanted money. She was suing for money and alimony and stuff, and he was really unhappy about that. Well, very close to the time where the divorce was going to be adjudicated, she died in a tragic car accident. There were, from tire tracks, 2 cars at the scene. It was obvious that her car had been sideswiped and forced off the road. They hit a pole, I believe. She was killed. The driver was paralyzed. This is late 1937. So then he and Toni allegedly got married, but there's debate about that. I don't know. Anyway, Toni, while shacked up with Eddie across the Red Sea, started having this relationship with this 10-year younger guy, George Reeves, the boy. And she spent a lot of money on him. She bought him a house in Benedict Canyon. Benedict Canyon is a pretty fancy area. A lot of famous people lived there. Rudolph Valentino lived in that neighborhood. Sharon Tate, that's where she was killed. A lot of Fred Astaire lived in that area. Anyway, Reeves really appreciated his young fans, was very concerned that the role really kept him out of the adult eye. He felt like he didn't have any adult fans. He never learned how popular he was. There was a whole cult following of adults who thought he was great. He called his costume a monkey suit, and it never really fit him properly. They never bothered. He never found out he had adult fans. And between the first and second season of filming, he got a few short-term jobs, but he was finding it increasingly hard to even get those because he got typecast. And they couldn't separate him. He was so closely associated with the image of Clark Kent and Superman that it was hard to put him in a role and get that willing suspension of disbelief for people. However, he was considered this really great person. People seemed to really like him. I'm reading between the lines here. I got the impression he drank a lot, but it wasn't an obnoxious kind of thing. He was kind to people, and they really liked him. While in the TV show, he worked with Toni Mannix, the girlfriend, to raise money for the Myasthenia Gravis Foundation across the country, and they appointed him national chairman in 1955. And just for a little added information, it's a neuromuscular disease. It's an autoimmune disorder where the antibodies attack the nervous system and cause skeletal muscle weakness. People get problems talking, their eyelids will droop, they're weak. I don't know how much they really knew about it in those days. I'm quite convinced they know a lot more about it today. Autoimmune things, the kind of like lupus. I can't think of another one. Well, allergies. Anyway, he also worked for the Treasury Department and made short films to get children to invest in government savings stamps. I'm not sure what that is, but he was very frustrated with his low salary. He didn't make very much money, and he thought that Superman was a one-dimensional character. I would think he was kind of two-dimensional, Clark Kent, Superman. Anyway, he associated the role sort of with ruining his credibility as a dramatic actor. He really wanted to be taken seriously. And then he was 40, and he was beginning to feel like it was too physically demanding to be leaping off of high buildings. So he did not renew his contract after the second season. He decided not to renew the contract. He established his own production company and came up with a TV adventure series called Port of Entry. It would be shot on location in Hawaii and Mexico. He wrote the pilot script, but the producers of Superman couldn't find a replacement for him, so they decided to play ball with him and offer him more money. So he was making $5,000 a week, which today would be like $57,000, but there was only 8 weeks in a series of filming. So anyway, the production company kind of went by the wayside, and Port of Entry was never made. In 1957, there was talk of making the movie Superman and the Secret Planet. They commissioned writers to do a script. But you know, there was all this talk between him quitting and then him renewing his contract. But in 1959, they came up with 26 new Superman episodes. The contracts were signed. The costumes were refitted, let's hope. They got new writers. The information that I got kind of jumped back again to 1956. So in 59, this is when the new episodes were, he decided to do more series. But in 56, he got a role in Westward the Wagons, and he wore a beard and a mustache, which helped to disguise him. This was his last film. In 56, he went on television and sang with Tony Bennett. In 57, he was on I Love Lucy, and he was just losing enthusiasm for the role in general. He told people he felt like he was wasting his life with this acting going nowhere. So he and some friends got together and came up with the answer to that. This is before the new 26 seasons. So in 57, they formed a touring group. They did a show where the first half of the show, they would do a sketch from Superman. And the second half hour, he would sing and accompany himself by playing the guitar. In 58, he broke up with Tony Mannix and he moved a new woman into the house on Benedict Canyon that Tony bought. He then announced his engagement. He met this woman somewhere at some nightclub. Her name was Lenore Lemon. She was called a society playgirl. Well, Tony tried everything to get him back. She called him endlessly. She got friends to intercede for her. She stalked him. She would sit in the car where he was and stare at him and stuff. And he had to get an attorney and tell her to back off, like, I guess, a pre-restraining order time. Then, and I think this is really scary, he had 3 car accidents in 3 months, and each car accident he was run off the road, or someone attempted to run him off the road. His pet dog was stolen out of his car. He never saw it again. And then he was in a very serious car crash. All the brake fluid was removed from his brakes, and going down a hill on Benedict Canyon, which can be windy, hilly, he hit a pole and he almost died. And the brakes were drained on purpose, the mechanic said. So here he is recovering. He had to take pills because of the accident. He's trying to recover, and he had financial problems. He kind of took the 26 episode contract as a small lifeline for Superman, you know, in 59, reviving the role. Then he got offered to be a director of a low-budget sci-fi film and to star in it too, but they never got any financing either. So his girlfriend, as I said, she was considered a party girl, and it was becoming problematic. She was doing a lot of drinking. He started to plan another Superman stage show, and they decided they were going to tour Australia. But he wasn't real eager, you know, to be Superman at 45. Just as an aside, to kind kind of person he was. He was nicknamed Honest George. People teased him and called him the Kentucky Colonel. Even though he was from Iowa, his family was in Kentucky, and I guess he spent enough time where he picked up a bit of an accent and mannerisms. He was considered a noble gentleman from Iowa, is what people called him. So George Reeves, on June 6th, 1959, somewhere between 1:30 and 2 o'clock in the morning, he died of a gunshot to the head upstairs in his Benedict Canyon home. He had friends partying downstairs. The girlfriend, Lemon, claims that she was downstairs when it happened. That's what she says, but the other guests, the other guests disagree. The guests downstairs heard a shot and allegedly heard more than one shot. And then she came downstairs saying, "Tell them I was down here. Tell them I was down here." So here are some interesting things around his death. The coroner said the bullet was in a very odd place for a suicide. Maybe it wasn't the coroner, it was the police, but they thought it was suspicious, the kind of wound, the location. There were no prints on the gun, not even his. No powder on his hands. The bullet was found in the ceiling, but the casings were found under his body. There were 2 other bullets in the floor under a carpet, like covered under a carpet. But the witnesses said they only heard one shot, but there were multiple shots. There was no forced entry, so they said he did it himself. There was a phone call at 4:30 in the morning from Tony Mannix to Phyllis Coates, Lois Lane, and she said, "George is dead. He's been murdered." Lemon, of course, immediately trying to deflect any guilt from her because something was not quite right about her situation. She claimed that he was depressed by a failed career. He was buried at Mount View Cemetery in Altadena. He got a star posthumously in the Walk of Fame in 1960. In 1985, he was named by DC Comics as one of the 50 who made DC great. His mother, back to right after he died, his mother hired Jerry Geisler to investigate. Geisler has an interesting history. He was the representative for Charlie Chaplin in his defense. Look that up. He defended Errol Flynn, and he did the divorce of Marilyn Monroe. So his mother refused to let him be buried until it was reinvestigated. They did a second autopsy. They found bruising on his head and body. They realized that right after he died, his body was washed before anyone could do gunshot residue testing. 2 weeks after Geisler was hired to investigate after the second autopsy, Geisler came to Reeves' mother and said, "Drop this. There are dangerous people involved in this, and you need to drop it. I quit." Alan Ladd and Gig Young were both friends of his, close friends of his, and they were very skeptical of the findings. His friend Rory Calhoun said, "No one in Hollywood believes this story. Nobody." There's a book called Hollywood Kryptonite by Kashner and Schoenberger, and this is this book that they wrote. Allegedly, they claim Eddie Mannix was involved, and there's rumors that he was tied to the mafia, and ties to the fact that, of course, that Reeves was having an affair with his wife, even though they weren't close, but that it was like an ordered hit. And there's a movie I haven't seen yet, but it's been recommended, called Hollywoodland, and it's the story, it's a fictionalized version, but there's some interesting stuff that's based on truth in it, including the story of Eddie Mannix and I've been told it has an ambiguous ending. So that's the sad saga of Superman, George Reeves. And I will be, as I said, doing a deeper dive, as I always did on my channel, my Substack, Ask Your Irish Granny. And then Deborah and I will get together and do our usual routine. So I invite you to check that out. I'm tortured by the fact that I have to ask people to pay in order to establish a little bit of privacy. But my suggestion would be do it on a monthly basis, and do it like 1 month, wait several months, and then get all caught up to try to minimize your expenses. And I truly need to thank the kind-hearted people that took a whole year of subscribing. I really appreciate it. I've been trying to put a lot of stuff out so that they don't feel, well, so that they feel they're getting their money's worth. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. So that's our true crime for this week, and I appreciate everybody so much. Please check your subscriptions, and I will be back, and I can confirm that I have a very solid yes from Larry Jordan. He will be joining us to talk about the real Marilyn Monroe book. We just don't have a date set yet. There are a couple of variables, but it's a for sure thing. So stay tuned. I don't hold your breath. It won't be this week or anything like that, but stay tuned because it's going to happen soon. So thank you very much. Slán go fóill, slánte.